Hello and welcome to our lesson on negative exponent property. First, let's talk some definitions. The power to which you raise the reciprocal of a number. That's what negative exponent property means. So if we say 4 to the negative cubed, it's right here, that means that you raise or increase the reciprocal of 4 to the power of 3. And we're going to talk about what a reciprocal means too. If you need to find a reciprocal, you just divide a number by 1. So the reciprocal of 4 is 1/4, and here's why it works. If you have a whole number, you can create a fraction simply by putting a 1 underneath the whole number. Right there, it makes it a fraction. Now, if you need it to be the reciprocal, you flip locations of the numbers. So if we flip it all around, it turns into 1/4. That's why 1/4 is the reciprocal of 4. Likewise, it works the other way, where if you start with 1/4, you've already got a fraction, and you just switch locations of the numerator and denominator, and it turns into the number 4. So 1/4, the reciprocal of that is 4. In other words, you just flip the fraction upside down. Let's try some examples. So we have 2, and we're taking it to the -3, which means we're looking for a reciprocal. First, let's make a fraction out of the number 2, and you do that by putting a 1 underneath the whole number 2. Now you've got a fraction. Ta-da! Now you're going to take the whole thing to the -3rd, which you need to flip it now because of that negative exponent. So we're going to flip locations of the numerator and denominator, which means it goes to 1/2. The minute you flip it, that negative on the exponent goes away. It did its job. It said flip it around. Now you just write it as a positive. And since you have 1/2 to the 3rd, you're going to have to simplify it. You have to multiply it out. So you're going to take 1/2 3 times in a row. So 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. Now, when you multiply with fractions, you just multiply straight across. So 1 times 1 times 1 is going to be 1. And 2 times 2 times 2 is going to be 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 2 is 8. So this would be your final answer. Now let's take a look at 4 to the -5th. Again, you start off with the number 4. It's a whole number, and we need to make it a fraction first, so put a 1 underneath it. Ta-da! Fraction. Now, you're going to take this to the -5th power, which means with the negative again, we're talking about flipping it, creating the reciprocal. So flip the numerator and the denominator, which causes this to become 1/4. And now the negative did its job right there, and so it goes away. And all that you're left with is just the regular 5 as your exponent. Now this is telling you to take 1/4 5 times in a row. So 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4, and then 2 more times. And you're going to have to multiply this all out. Again, if you're going to multiply with fractions, you just go straight across. So 1, all these ways times 1, it's still going to be 1. And then on the bottom, you're going to have 4 times 4 times, and all of that. So 4 times 4, let's write it out here. 4 times 4 is going to be 16. Another 4 times 4 is 16. And then you have it multiplied by the number 4. So you're going to have 16 times 16. If you want to, you can do it old school multiplication. And if you've forgotten how to do this, you should go back and relearn it, because it becomes very helpful for you later. So when we do that, we're going to end up with, we'll put it over here, 256, and then we still have to multiply it one more time, because we took these two. Now we have to multiply it by that 4. So let's take 256 times 4. 256 and multiply it by 4. You need to carry your 2. You have 22. That's 8, 9, 10. So you've got 1,024. And remember back up here, when we flipped it or found the reciprocal, it was 1/1024. And if you think about it, because it's a fraction, it's one tiny little piece out of over 1,000. So this is a very tiny, tiny piece. All right, for the 1/8 to the -2, that negative number on your exponent says flip it, find the reciprocal. So you're going to take 1/8 and you're going to turn it upside down. So it's simply 8. And since the negative on the exponent just did its job with the flip, now you're just going to drop the negative and write 2. So it's simply 8 times 8, which is 64. So that's your final answer for that. Now let's take a look for negative 1/5 to the negative 4th. The negative that's attached to the fraction itself needs to stay attached to the fraction. It doesn't go away when you do the reciprocal. The only negative that disappears is the negative on the exponent. So let's find the reciprocal of negative 1/5. Flip everything around and you're going to have negative 5. And this is still having to go to the 4th, but notice the negative on the 4 is gone because once we flipped it and found the reciprocal, that negative did its job and disappears. So you're going to take negative 5 4 times in a row. Now if you're multiplying a negative an even number of times, the answer is still going to be a positive number. You've got negative times negative, which is positive. Positive times a negative is another negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So you have a positive number. And if you take 5 times 5 times 5 times 5, you end up with 625. So that would be your final answer. All right, let's take a look. How does this work in algebra? Now we're just talking about adding a variable on. Same concept, we're just adding a letter in. Reciprocals, again, same way it worked before. If we have x as your variable and you need the reciprocal, make it into a fraction, put a 1 underneath, and you've got a fraction. And now, for a reciprocal, flip locations. So you're going to have 1/x. It works the same way here. If I start with the fraction 1/x and I flip it, I'm going to end up with just x. Flip the fractions upside down. So let's try it. You've got x to the negative 3. That negative says reciprocal. So first of all, let's make them a fraction. Let's put a 1 underneath, and it's to the negative 3. That negative says flip them around. So you've got a 1/x. The negative did its job, it goes away, and the 3. That's as far as you can go. Because if we multiply x times x times x, it's still going to be x cubed. And since we don't know what x stands for, that's the best we can do. That's your final answer. Let's take a look at x to the negative 5th. Again, if we're talking about x, make them into a fraction, and then flip them around because you have a negative exponent right there. So you've got 1/x, negative did its job, it's gone, to the 5th power. And that's as far as you can go because there's no other multiplication. Now here, we start off with a fraction. So if we have 1/x to the negative 2, that negative says flip. We're going to flip locations. It turns into x. Negative is gone because it did its job, and we're just left with 2. So it's x squared. Now let's take a look at the last one. We've got a negative 1/x. The negative right there is attached to the fraction. It's got to stay attached to it. It doesn't disappear on a reciprocal. So because it's a negative exponent, this says flip. We're going to flip them around. It's x/1 with the negative still there from the fraction. But the negative on the exponent disappears because we did our reciprocal. So they're asking us to take negative x 4 times in a row. And when you multiply a negative an even number of times, it turns positive. Negative times negative is positive. Positive times negative is negative. And a negative times a negative is a positive. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4 x's. And if you remember, when you multiply exponents, you don't really do it. You add them. So we've got x to the 4th. And that is your final answer. Just as a quick review, when you have a negative exponent for a fraction, it means you find the reciprocal of the original number, which means you flip the fraction upside down. In algebra, you do the exact same thing. Who cares? There's a variable involved. You still flip it upside down. And once you find the reciprocal, you drop the negative sign from the exponent only. That's the only negative that should disappear. And that's it for our lesson on negative exponent properties.